Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning into my Zoom lecture tonight. I am Malcom Lobley, Treasurer since 1988 of the Yorkshire Heraldry Society, and hopeful that members of the Thoresby Society, the premier historical society of Leeds, might find parts of my talk interesting. The third organisation of importance here is our host at this recording, the Leeds Library. As this talk is pre-recorded, I'm able to tell you it will last 45 minutes. I have around 50 slides, and I will be here to answer queries after the talk. Thank you. You will see from my first slide that my photograph is somewhat historic, probably when I first assembled information on the topic. In a previous life, I was a bank manager. To succeed in a career in banking, one had to defy nature. In banking, one rose through gravity and fell through levity. I would like to thank the Leeds Library and particularly Claire, who is recording this Zoom presentation. The library is the oldest private subscription library in England. I am in the librarian's office, and on a previous recording, which showed the background, an 8-year-old fan said, "Granny, does Malcolm have all those books?" So if I may remind you of the development of banking in England during the Middle Ages. In spite of a mature industry in London, there were no recorded premises solely operating as banks in Yorkshire in 1750. However, it did not take us long to catch on, driven by the need for finance for the Industrial Revolution. So I've added to my slides to give a little background to banking in general in the Middle Ages. The first slide you'll see is a bezant, which is a gold coin, and if you're very observant, you'll see this on lots and lots of coats of arms of people associated with finance and banking. We'll see them as we go through the presentation. So here's a little story about how everything developed. Following the expulsion of the Jews in 1290, their successors from Lombardy settled in Lombard Street, would you believe? And it became the financial hub. Goldsmiths and scriveners, who of course were people like lawyers, I suppose, who drew up documents, used signs outside their premises to advertise themselves. Apparently some was so big they pulled the front wall down of the premises. So there we go. Some of the symbols have been revived and survive, and here is a selection of them from, I think, probably just a couple of 100 years ago. Some of them will seem familiar to you, particularly the black horse and the spread eagle, of course, which is Barclays, isn't it? So here are the present coats of arms of two of our current day banks. On the left-hand side, you'll see Lloyd's with the famous black horse as one of the supporters, and look at the bezants on the chevron too. You'll also notice that the other supporter is a goat. Now, I have never seen Lloyd's use a goat in their advertising, but there we go. I suppose you can be selective. At the right-hand side, we have the coat of arms of Barclays, and you saw the spread eagle on the sign in Threadneedle in Lombard Street. Now, apparently, Barclays only registered this as their coat of arms in 1937, and the College of Arms insisted that it was differenced, and so they imposed on it 3 crowns, which I notice on the Lombard Street signs. One of the signs is 3 crowns, but I'm not sure that that's connected with Barclays. Now, my favourite sign is the grasshopper. I don't know why. I just like grasshoppers. And this sign was the emblem of Sir Thomas Gresham, who was a famous diplomat and financier in Queen Elizabeth I's time. Now, Martin's Bank adopted the grasshopper as their symbol, but unfortunately they were swallowed in due course by Barclays. However, one or two of the Barclays branches that were formerly Martin's in the 1960s, you'd see a little grasshopper. This was a Martin's Bank branch, which I thought was a nice touch, but I think that's fallen by the wayside now. So in London, business was brisk. The goldsmiths and scriveners developed their deposit receipts into banknotes, and written instructions from their customers became cheques. But like everything else, the good times don't last forever. Now, in London, lending to the crown was big business, and the goldsmiths made a lot of money lending to the government. However, the problem with lending to one person too much is that if they stop paying, you've got a problem. And this is what happened. The Crown just refused to repay. So unfortunately, that ruined many of the nascent bankers. In 1692, the stop of the Exchequer effectively stopped the government repaying the loans that they'd borrowed. So they had to find a solution. In 1694, they founded the Bank of England, and the sole purpose of the bank was to service the national debt. It was given exclusive rights to issue banknotes within 65 miles of the capital, and no banking partnership had to have more than 6 partners. So that was an interesting situation because, of course, effectively, Leeds being way more than 65 miles out of London, they were not restricted in terms of note issue. So that's one of the nice bits that we're coming to talking about Leeds banks. As the 19th century developed, there were several acts of parliament and so on that regulated the banks. And you'll see here in 1826, they did allow banks with more than 6 shareholders, but it was unlimited liability, which I would have thought was not very attractive. In 1844, no bank which was not issuing notes would be allowed to do so, which meant effectively over the years, a number of banks issuing notes diminished as they amalgamated and so on. In 1857, limited liability was allowed when forming a bank. However, amazingly, it wasn't popular for 20 years, not quite sure why. I'd have thought it'd been very popular. So, in spite of the obstacles, banking grew and flourished in Leeds. And I've got a list here of some of the Leeds banks since the first ones in the 1750s. There were so many, I had to use an Excel spreadsheet, in fact, more than one. So I'm going to look at various of these banks, trying to find the ones that I've got copies of banknotes and checks, and we'll pick out some of the heraldry there with my obvious interest in that. So let's just have a look at this list. Now, Alan at the Thoresby Society said, Malcolm, that list, those names are a bit small. However, I'm slightly IT literate, so I found out that I can make that larger by pressing Control. Oh, but I need a mouse. Thank you. Oh, look at that. I'm not quite sure how I maneuver that, but at least you can see a little bit more of it there. So we'll see if we can see a clearer picture here. You'll see the first name on there is Leeds Premier Bank, which is Beckett's Bank, and I will talk about them but much later on in the lecture. And then as we go through, the dates are roughly in the order that they would have been founded, but they do jump about a little bit. It's very difficult to get everything sorted into the right order here. You'll see here that the third column is the successor institution, and all these beautifully named local banks eventually became the ones we're familiar with, such as Lloyd's and so on. And NatWest, of course, is the one that Beckett's was absorbed into. Now, there's one here that tried to sneak past but didn't. I'll have to make this a little bit smaller, I think. Yeah, you'll see on Perfect's Bank at the right-hand side, a large snake cucumber was found growing in the garden in their offices in Pontefract. Now, disappointingly, that emblem didn't become a symbol of the bank, but nevertheless, I thought it was interesting enough to find out a bit more about snake cucumbers, which I'll come on to shortly. Okay, so this is the second page, and as I say, I'm just showing you these briefly, just to give you an idea of the amazing number of banks that there were in Leeds. So these will be names you've never heard of, I'm sure, but the absorbing banks are more familiar. But even some of those have vanished too into the big four as we have them today. Another interesting factor here are the addresses. It's surprising how the bank started, usually in Briggate, but then moved across to Commercial Street and eventually, of course, as they are now, very much in Park Row. Okay, so here's the last one you'll be pleased to know. And again, bank names that I'm sure you will never have heard of. Leeds Borough Bank, I've not heard of that. Sawyer Bailey, who issuing notes for the Bridlington Bank. Just amazing. Now there's another one that was on the previous page. I'll try and go back. Ah, there we go. Down. I was amazed that when I saw this name, Charing Cross Bank Limited, founded in 1870. It had a branch in Leeds in 1907, but payments were suspended in 1910, which I suspect means that the bank was wound up at that stage. But as I say, just so many unusual names, but very interesting nevertheless. Obviously, the place would be full of banks in the 1870s. Ah, now then, this is what you've been waiting for, the snake cucumber. I didn't know anything about it, and I'm sure you don't either. So here's a little description that you might wish to read before we go back to the banks. Here we go. Now then, at last we're on to the Leeds banks. Today we're so familiar with Bank of England notes being the principal currency. Occasionally we'll see an odd Scottish or Northern Irish note, but it is occasionally. However, there was no such boredom in Victorian times. Private banking institutions outside London were able to issue their own notes and did so. Leeds banks were no exception. Bank of England notes up to 1960 were only in black and white. This caused problems, as I shall mention later. And they didn't feature the monarch until 1960, but that didn't hold back the Leeds banks. They were able to do that. You can see that from my previous list there was an explosive growth of banks in the period, but it was opposed, when the banks were being opened. In 1804, Edward Peckover decided to establish a bank in Bradford, and he was scornfully told by a settled banker, "There is already a bank at Leeds, one in Halifax and another at Settle. I do not think there is scope for one at Bradford." Well, it was proved to be very wrong, although the way things are going at the moment, maybe his prophecy will come correct. In 1985, the numbers of bank and building society branches had grown to 22,000. I must say that now it's reduced down to 7,000, which again is a colossal change, isn't it? So now for the specifics. One of the first banks in the area was J&W Perfect of Pontefract. You may have noticed mention of the snake cucumber, and I've given you information about that already. But here is a Leeds banknote. On the face of it, you just see Leeds Bank, but if you look closely, it's issued from the Leeds Commercial Bank, which in fact is a partnership, not a joint stock bank. It was common practice, presumably to enhance the bank's status, to call it a bank and not simply have a list of names. But you'll see here, this note is signed by the by the partners. And if you were very quick on my first list of slides, you'll have seen that those partners on one of the earlier banks that were listed. So there we go. That's our first note. Now, here we have the Leeds and West Riding Banking Company, 1842. You'll see they have tried anything to do with pictures and colours obviously helps against forgery. And so there was a move towards doing that. And the Leeds and West Riding Banking Company had a lovely vignette there with Britannia. And you'll see if you look closely that there is a coat of arms on there. Now, that's an interesting one because you'll see it's quite a complicated shield. I think we can decipher that. Now, here are two shields. The first one was prior to 1837. Now, when Queen Victoria acceded to the throne, they had to remove the Hanoverian escutcheon and crown because as a woman, she was unable to succeed to the throne of Hanover on Hanoverian law, under Hanoverian law. The arms have remained unchanged since then. So if we go back, you'll see that it almost certainly is the earlier shield. However, the date of this check, if you look carefully, is 1842, which is a few years after Queen Victoria came to the throne. So I presume they must have had a stock that they weren't issuing or something like that. Right, here's another one, the Leeds Union Bank. This is 1824. Now, again, although it's called a bank, you'll see that the signature on it, there are two signatures on it, are two partners. And it went by the name of William Williams Brown and Jason. And the managing director was Henry Oxley, who signed this banknote. And so as our guest, William Williams Brown. I think that's a lovely name, don't you? Again, it's a partnership that's using a bank name. However, there's a twist on this one. Let's just have a look at the back of the note. Wow, what do you think about that? That's a very good anti-forgery item, isn't it? If you look closely, you'll see at the top it says 5p. Now that is stamp duty for the note, so the revenue would get that. But this device, this complicated device, was the idea of it was to prevent forgery, and it was the invention of a very famous son of Leeds, Sir William Congreve, and he was born just a couple of miles down the road from me, so that's excellent. And it was his idea to have these complex multicolored designs, and these were typical of what were printed on the banknotes. Now, in 1817, you'll see 31,000 forgeries were detected, so there was a need. However, this is typical. A royal commission examined the prevention of fraud, but none of the recommendations were adopted for the Bank of England notes. So in other words, the poor provincial bankers had to put these complicated reverse things on, but the Bank of England didn't bother, and their notes were only black and white anyway, so it was a little bit of a wasted effort. However, it's very nice to see another local man in the slide on this one. Right, so this is a check from William Williams Brown and Co. And it was interesting, by 1897, the partnership had dropped the Leeds Union Bank on its checks. Presumably the notes were still banks. Yeah, Leeds Bank here, £10. Again, we've got the famous William Williams Brown and Company. And a vignette there of some sort of trade and so on, which Leeds was famous for. On this one, they've gone to take the coat of arms from Leeds and a nice picture of the town hall. I was slightly baffled by this. I thought, well, the town hall wasn't built in 1813, but that, of course, was when the bank was founded. This would be issued much later in the century. That's a nice picture of the town hall. Not in 1857. I can see we've got traffic lights there. Okay, another bank now, Halifax and Huddersfield Union Banking. Two nice checks there. And there's a beehive there on the left of the lower check, and that usually signifies industry and heraldry. So another one. This is 1903. You'll see how the typeface changes over time, and this is a more modern, if that's the right word, typeface there. Now, talking about the Bank of England notes, this is an early copy of a Bank of England note. You'll see it's dated 1800 and rather worse for wear. But even in 1958, when they were recalling the Bank of England notes, you'll see that there isn't an amazing difference between in 150 years. And these were the notes that were recalled before our standard issue of notes became current in 1960. So I remember those when I started work at the bank. People were still surrendering them. They'd gone out of kilter, as it were, but people were still bringing them in to change for the more modern, smaller notes that didn't seem half as attractive. Right, another bank here, West Yorkshire Bank Limited. Again, they've used a very complicated printing situation and decided that because it was West Yorkshire, they would adopt the coat of arms of the four principal cities and towns in the area. So they've made rather a nice job of putting that on the note. Here's one of my favourites, the Halifax Joint Stock Bank, which had a branch, of course, in Leeds. On their notes, they really went one step ahead and decided to include the monarch. I must admit, when I first saw the picture, I didn't know who the monarch was, but it apparently was George IV. So he wasn't immediately prior to Victoria, was he? I think it was, can't remember who was prior to Victoria. Anyway, he was slightly before that. And they printed his picture on the banknote and a lovely picture of the Halifax Wool Exchange as well. The reverse of that did not have one of the Congreve vignettes, but as you can see, it was a very complicated, must have been quite a difficult note to copy. So West Yorkshire Bank, again, if you look at the check, you can see the heraldry at the left-hand side, which is very good. And we've seen these ones before. Right, now then, what happened in the 19th century was there was a tremendous amalgamation of banks. Quite often what happened, of course, they were required to be providing finance for industry that needed quite a lot of it, you know, for founding the mills and the mines and the steelworks. And so the smaller banks that had started off very well and were doing well were obviously struggling to provide the finance that was required. And so there was a natural tendency to amalgamate, and this is what happened. So the whole of the banks listed here eventually became HSBC, but as a lot of older viewers will know, we like to think of it as Midland Bank. So the earlier ones were Exchange and Discount Bank and Leeds County Bank in Leeds. But you see, at the time, Midland was called the Birmingham and Midland Bank, and then became the London and Midland Bank. And then at the other side of the coin, of course, our old friends Perfect and Co. and Coates, Perfect, Britain, Dresser and Co. I think Dresser and Co. were at Thirsk. They were all absorbed by the Yorkshire District Banking Company. And that then became Yorkshire Banking Company, and other banks were added to the list. And you'll see down at the bottom here, eventually it became London City and Midland doing half the job, and London Joint Stock Bank at the other half. Now, I've got an arrow here for York City and County Bank. That was a very large bank, and it was quite a coup, I suppose, for Midland to to absorb that bank. The guy who was running Midland at the time was called Sir Edward Holden, and he was a real acquisitor. As you can see, he was responsible for accumulating all the banks into Midland, and eventually they became London Joint City of Midland and then simply Midland. Now, just going back now to our good friends at Pontefract, this old note we've got here is from Perfect's Bank. Now, as you can see on the back, it has the vignette on, the anti-forgery vignette, but I'm sorry to have to tell you that it was a forgery. This was provided, I think, by I think the one of the archives people in London. So that was slightly disappointing that a Perfect's Bank should be a forgery. But you can see it's signed by John Perfect himself. Now, we're coming now to a very interesting bank. And this was an important component of HSBC. It was the Yorkshire District Bank. Now, here we have what I would say was quite a boring cheque for the Yorkshire District Bank, 1839, and then slightly better, 1843. However, what happened, it was founded in 1834, and it quickly grew and soon had a branch network. However, it was never well run, and following defalcations and difficulties at other banks, the Yorkshire District Bank fell on hard times. But a new bank arose, Yorkshire Banking Company, and took over the successful parts of the Yorkshire District Bank. No depositor in the Yorkshire District Bank lost money, but the shareholders lost most of their funds. However, the new bank took over the old Yorkshire District Bank premises at West Bar by City Square. Now, here is a sketch. Look at that lovely sketch. That was what Leeds was like in Georgian times, you see. You'll recognise on the right-hand side what is now what was the Midland Bank branch, but I think it's now a wine bar. At the opposite side of the road, what a beautiful building. What a pity that that was ever knocked down. And you can also see up Park Row, and is that St Anne's Cathedral at the top, I think, there, before they pulled it down. So I love that etching. It's good. However, let's look at the photograph, which isn't quite as good. Now, the interesting thing to me about that photograph, I'd never seen it before. I was very pleased to get a copy of it. It's exactly the same shape, really, as the later building that Midland Bank put on the same site. You'll recognise that at the right-hand side. But that's a 1901 photograph. And I remember the building on the left, but that's gone, of course, now. It's some sort of a modern hotel, I think, isn't it? So it's very interesting to see these old photographs. Right, now one of the banks absorbed by Midland was the Yorkshire Banking Company, and here is one of their notes. Again, that has a picture, doesn't it? That picture in the centre is of the bank that we saw at, near City Square, West Bar they call it. I'd never heard it called West Bar before. So that was York City and County Banking Company. Now, I do know that they were a highly successful bank before they were taken over by the Midland. And I've written down somewhere, or I thought I had. They had about 200 branches anyway, which was quite substantial. So it was a bonus for Midland to acquire that bank. And I think they changed the name from York City and County Banking Company. But as you can imagine, presumably all these notes from different banks were floating about in Victorian times. Now, I haven't mentioned the Bank of England, and it's important because you might imagine when the Bank of England when did it come? 1829. The Bank of England opened a branch in Leeds in 1829. It moved from various premises until it ended up here in Park Row. But you might think, oh, if the Bank of England are in Leeds, that's an accolade for Leeds and for everyone connected with Leeds, including the existing banks. That wasn't the case, I'm afraid. There was opposition to the Bank of England and also opposition to the circulation of its notes from local banks. At a meeting held by the Huddersfield Banking Company, they spoke of the Bank of England spreading its pestilential branches. A significant worry for the existing local county banks was the forgery. And as you've seen, there were huge numbers of forged notes floating about. So they were dead against the Bank of England. But I was quite surprised. I thought the Bank of England would have been welcomed as an accolade for Leeds itself. Not so, I'm afraid. Here we go. Now, I suppose I can't go any further now without reverting to our friends Beckett and Co. These were the first bankers in Leeds, and you'll see that it was a series of partnerships. And although Beckett is mentioned in the middle of the top check there, there are other people who came and went. The second check down on the list there, Beckett, Blades and Co. So they're all at different times. Now you'll see here that this is called the Leeds Bank, 1799, and for some reason they issued it for a guinea. Well, why not? I suppose guineas were popular then. Again, they've used a bank name, even though it's a partnership, and they have the Leeds coat of arms to enhance its status. But you'll notice that the signatories are someone called Calverley and a Beckett, one of the Beckett family as well. Now, later on, the Beckett checks became a little bit more standardized, if you like. If you look at the bottom check, that one has an interesting motif on. Now, the boar's head is part of the Beckett family coat of arms. And so they started using that on some of the checks, particularly on their branches in the East Riding. So we'll see a few more checks here. The York and East Riding Bank, York Bank, East Riding Bank. And you'll see that really hidden behind all these were the Becketts. Wherever you looked, it was the Becketts. But here they've dropped the boar's head and just put initials on the note. The most famous Beckett of all was Rupert Beckett, 1870 to 1955. He was responsible for tremendous growth in the bank, and at the time the bank also were bankers for Leeds City Council, which was quite an accolade. He went on to become chairman of Westminster Bank, because of course at the end of the day the Westminster Bank absorbed Beckett's, although I think Beckett's were the last at the time of the amalgamation with London County and Westminster and Pars Bank Limited. They had 37 branches, so that's our most impressive banker from Leeds. Now just to look at the boar's head again. The family crest of the Becketts of Somerby Park in Lincolnshire had the boar's head, and that appeared on the check. If you look at the right-hand boar's head, if you're very observant, you'll see there's no tongue. Now, those of you that know will realise that the Bradford coat of arms has no tongue. There's a lovely story about why the tongue doesn't exist, but Bradford City Council have the boar's head without the tongue, and the Yorkshire Penny Bank in the early part of the century printed cheques, and for their Bradford branches they respected the Bradford City Council and did the boar's head without the tongue, which I thought was a nice touch. And if you go to Harrogate at the Yorkshire Building Society, you will see a carved stone coat of arms with 3 boar's heads. That's a better picture of it there. I'd like to acknowledge these people who supplied me with information for the talk. And here are just a couple of other notes from other parts of the country: Warrington, Stratford-on-Avon. Now, this is an interesting little branch here, the London Joint Stock Bank Limited. Where do you think that might be? Well, I'll tell you, it's in Knaresborough, so you can never tell where these banks are going to turn up. Well, that's the end of my lecture. I hope that it conveys the pride I feel in the early banks in Leeds for the support they gave to the city, resulting in it being a unique and dynamic place that it is today. We can all be proud of the city. I hope you agree. Thank you.